The morning frost of October 1863 painted Petersburg's windows with delicate patterns that reminded Pavel Ivanovich of the finest filigree work. Our master silversmith, 42 years of age and bearer of calluses earned through decades of honest labor, rose before dawn as was his custom. The Gorokhovaya Street workshop demanded early attention. Silver, you see, shows its true nature best in the first light of day. Pavel's fingers, thick but surprisingly nimble, traced the edge of a sugar bowl he'd been finishing for a merchant's wife. The woman had insisted on roses, always roses, as if the entire botanical world had conspired to produce only this one flower worthy of silver representation. 3 dozen roses, she'd specified, and Pavel had given her 3 dozen and 1, the extra hidden beneath the handle where only she would find it. Such small kindnesses cost him nothing, but brought disproportionate joy, though he'd never admit to such sentimentality.
The workshop occupied the ground floor of a narrow building squeezed between a bookbinder and a German pharmacy. Above, his living quarters housed himself and his widowed sister, Vera Petrovna, 38, and still handsome despite her mourning clothes. She moved about the kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing the morning's kasha while humming an old song about nightingales. Pavel noticed she'd been humming more lately, though he couldn't say why. Young Timofey burst through the workshop door, bringing with him the October cold and an energy that belonged exclusively to 19-year-olds in love. The boy, for Pavel still thought of him as such, despite his capable hands and growing skill, had been mooning over Merchant Kulikov's daughter for months now. "Master Pavel, forgive my lateness," Timofey stammered, though he was actually early. Love, Pavel mused, disturbs one's sense of time most peculiarly. The apprentice set about stoking the forge while Pavel examined the day's commissions. A christening cup for a civil servant's new son, repair work on an icon frame from the Smolny convent, and the usual collection of bent spoons and tarnished trays that kept bread on their table. This was the reality of a silver master's life, not the grand ceremonial pieces that brought fame, but the steady accumulation of small victories over decay and time. Petersburg itself seemed caught in a similar struggle between grandeur and decay. 2 years had passed since the Tsar freed the serfs, and the city hummed with nervous energy. Change haunted the streets like morning fog off the Neva. Pavel had noticed his customers' shifting moods. The nobility clutched their silver tighter, as if precious metals could anchor them against the tide of reform, while the emerging merchant class commissioned ever more elaborate pieces, eager to transform new money into old respectability. "Master," Timofey ventured while polishing a tea service, "do you believe a man can rise above his station through honest work alone?" The question carried weight beyond its words. Pavel understood the boy was really asking about Anna Kulikova, about whether a foundling raised by church charity might dare court a merchant's daughter. "I believe," Pavel answered carefully, "that silver teaches us patience. You cannot rush the work, cannot force the metal to become what it isn't ready to be. But with time, with skill—" He let the thought hang between them like incense in a church. The Morning Post brought an unexpected commission, a letter sealed with the Dolgorukov coat of arms. Count Arkady Petrovich required Pavel's immediate attention regarding a matter of some delicacy. The payment offered was generous, suspiciously so. Pavel had learned long ago that when aristocrats pay too much, they're buying more than craftsmanship. They're purchasing discretion, complicity, or sometimes just the comfort of commanding someone beneath them. Vera appeared with tea, her movements carrying that particular grace of women who've known better times.
Her husband had been a minor official in the Ministry of Finance before consumption took him 5 years past. She caught Pavel frowning at the letter. "The Dolgorukovs," she said, reading the seal. "They say the Count's new wife is young enough to be his daughter." "They say many things," Pavel replied, though he too had heard the gossip. Count Dolgorukov, 48 and recently remarried to a beauty of 23, had become one of those subjects Petersburg society discussed in whispers that everyone somehow heard. The workshop filled with its daily symphony, the whisper of files against silver, the occasional ring of hammer on anvil, the hiss of quenching metal. These sounds formed the rhythm of Pavel's world, as reliable as his own heartbeat. He'd inherited this space from his father, who'd received it from his father before him. 3 generations of silver masters, each teaching the next that survival meant understanding not just metal, but men. As noon approached, Pavel prepared for his visit to the Dolgorukov mansion. He selected his best coat, the one with only minor repairs visible at the cuffs, and instructed Timofey on the day's remaining work. The boy nodded absently, his mind clearly elsewhere, probably composing another of his painfully earnest poems for Anna Kulikova. Youth believes in the power of words, Pavel thought, while age knows the weight of silence. The streets between Gorokovaya and the Dolgorukov mansion on Milyanaya traced a path through Petersburg's social anatomy. Pavel walked past the shops where he bought his supplies, through the districts where clerks and petty merchants hustled for their kopecks, and finally into that rarefied realm where carriages outnumbered pedestrians, and the buildings themselves seemed to hold their breath in perpetual genuflection to wealth. The Dolgorukov mansion rose from Milyanaya Street like a sugar confection, all white columns and gilded details that caught the weak October sun. Pavel counted 16 windows across the facade, each one larger than his entire workshop window. A liveried footman, whose disdain could have frozen the Neva in July, examined Pavel's modest calling card before grudgingly admitting him to the marble anteroom. Count Arkady Petrovich Dolgorukov received him in a study that smelled of leather, tobacco, and that particular mustiness that accumulates in rooms where important decisions age like wine. The Count, 48 years preserved in French tailoring and English pomade, possessed the kind of thin elegance that suggested his ancestors had been refining themselves, while Pavels were still learning to hold hammers properly. "You come highly recommended," the Count began without preamble. "Father Seraphim speaks of your discretion." The priest's name carried weight. He served not just the Dolgorukovs, but half the noble families between here and Moscow. Pavel bowed slightly, acknowledging the compliment while calculating its cost. The Count led him through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors to a dining room that could have hosted a small battalion. At the room's heart stood a table of dark wood, and upon it, in a case lined with midnight blue velvet, lay 12 silver knives. Even from a distance, Pavel recognized exceptional work. The handles showed hunting scenes so detailed you could count the hound's teeth. "These knives," the Count said, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper, "belonged to my great-grandmother, Princess Natalia Dolgorukova. She received them from the Empress Catherine herself, a gift for exposing a conspiracy against the crown." He paused, allowing the weight of history to settle. "They possess, shall we say, unusual properties." Pavel examined the knives with professional interest. The silver was exceptional, probably from the Urals, worked by a master whose name was lost to time. Each handle depicted a different scene from Russian folklore: firebirds, golden fish, Baba Yaga's hut on chicken legs. The craftsmanship exceeded anything Pavel could produce, and he felt that familiar mix of admiration and envy that true artistry always provoked. "The legend states," the Count continued, watching Pavel closely, "that these knives will tarnish instantly in the hands of anyone harboring murderous intent."
3 times in our family's history they've revealed assassins before they could strike. Pavel kept his expression neutral, though his mind immediately catalogued the various compounds that could cause silver to tarnish. Sulfur, of course, but also certain acids, even the oils from particular foods. His father had taught him that half of a silver master's work involved managing the mythology people attached to precious metals. "A remarkable heritage, Your Excellency." "Tonight," the Count said, tension creeping into his cultured voice, "I'm hosting a dinner for potential investors in a railway venture. One guest in particular, Baron von Rosen. I have reasons to suspect his intentions go beyond mere business." The name was familiar. Baron Nikolai von Rosen, 35, one of those Baltic Germans who'd been growing rich from Russia's sudden hunger for mechanical progress. The newspapers painted him as brilliant but ruthless, the kind of man who calculated human costs in the margins of his ledgers. That evening, Pavel found himself in the peculiar position of attending a noble dinner not as a guest, but as a specialist, stationed discreetly in an alcove where he could observe the table. The Countess Maria Alexandrovna, 23 and possessing the kind of beauty that made men write bad poetry, presided over the gathering with practiced grace. Her smile never wavered, though Pavel noticed how her fingers trembled slightly when she reached for her wine. The guests assembled like players in an expensive theatrical production. Baron von Rosen arrived precisely at 8, his Prussian punctuality as sharp as his jaw. He moved through the room with an engineer's efficiency, calculating angles and distances. The other guests, a collection of ministry officials, minor nobles and their wives, orbited around him and the Count like planets around competing suns. Father Seraphim offered a blessing before the meal, his 61 years evident in his trembling hands, but not his resonant voice. "May this food nourish our bodies, and this fellowship nourish our souls," he intoned, though Pavel detected something else in his tone, warning, perhaps, or resignation. The dinner progressed through its courses with choreographed precision. Conversation flowed from the weather to the new opera at the Mariinsky, carefully skirting the dangerous topics of politics and reform. The Count steered discussion toward the railway venture, painting pictures of progress that would connect Petersburg to the empire's farthest reaches. Baron von Rosen countered with his own vision, speaking of German efficiency and British investment. Then came the moment that would transform an evening of mannered tension into something altogether different. As the roast was served, each guest received one of the legendary knives. Pavel watched the Count's eyes fix on Baron von Rosen with predatory intensity. The Baron, reaching for his knife to cut the meat, paused as the silver handle began to darken in his grip. The transformation was immediate and undeniable. The bright silver dulled, then blackened, spreading like spilled ink across the intricate hunting scenes. A lady gasped. Someone dropped a wine glass, the crash sharp as breaking bones. The Baron stared at his hand as if it had betrayed him, the blackened knife trembling between his fingers. "Murderer," someone whispered, though Pavel couldn't identify the source. The words seemed to multiply, echoing from mouth to mouth until the very air thrummed with accusation. The Count rose slowly,
triumphantly. "The silver never lies," he announced.
"Baron von Rosen, you came to my house with death in your heart." The Baron's Germanic composure finally cracked.
"This is absurd. A trick, a fraud!" But his protests rang hollow against the evidence still darkening in his hand. He set the knife down with exaggerated care, the blackened silver stark against the white tablecloth like an accusation written in metal. In the chaos that followed, ladies retiring with vapors, men demanding explanations, servants scurrying for sal volatile, Pavel found himself holding the corrupted knife. The Count pressed it into his hands with an urgency that suggested more than simple cleaning was required. "You must purify it," he whispered. "Restore it. The family honor." Pavel wrapped the knife carefully in soft cloth, noting how the tarnish had an unusual pattern, almost crystalline in structure. His trained fingers detected something else, a faint residue, slightly sticky, certainly not natural to silver.
As he prepared to leave, he caught the Countess watching him from across the room. In her eyes, he saw not shock or fear, but something far more complex. A calculation, perhaps, or recognition. Pavel's workshop at midnight possessed a different character entirely from its daytime industriousness. The forge lay cold, the tools rested in their prescribed places, and only a single oil lamp illuminated the workbench where the blackened knife waited like an accusation. Our master silversmith had sent Timofey home hours ago, despite the boy's protests and curiosity. Some investigations, Pavel knew, required solitude. The tarnish pattern troubled him. Natural oxidation follows predictable paths, spreading evenly across silver's surface like age across a face. This blackening, however, showed distinct boundaries, crystalline formations that reminded Pavel of frost on glass. He prepared his testing solutions: ammonia, salt water, various acids, arranging them like a chemist in one of those new laboratories the university had been building. Under his jeweler's loupe, the truth began revealing itself with the reluctance of a confession drawn from a guilty child. The knife wasn't silver at all, or rather, not entirely. The core was indeed silver, good quality, but the surface bore a thin coating of something else. A clever amalgam that mimicked silver's luster perfectly. Pavel had seen such work before, usually in pieces meant to deceive buyers about weight or purity, but never with such sophistication. He applied a drop of ammonia solution to an inconspicuous spot. Nothing. Salt water produced no reaction either. Then, remembering the slight stickiness he'd detected earlier, Pavel tried something unusual. A weak citric acid solution he kept for removing certain stains. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. The blackness spread from the point of contact like spilled wine on linen, exactly matching the pattern he'd observed at dinner. "Clever," he muttered to the empty workshop. Someone had coated this knife, and presumably only this knife, with a compound that remained stable until exposed to acid. The Baron's knife had been marked, selected, targeted. But how had acid found its way onto the Baron's hands during dinner? Vera descended the stairs, wrapped in her late husband's old robe. "You're destroying your eyes in this light," she said, bringing him tea without his asking. She possessed that gift of appearing precisely when needed, a talent she'd perfected during her husband's long illness. "The Dolgorukov knife?" she asked, noting the elaborate case. Pavel showed her the blackened blade, explained his discovery.
Vera listened with the intelligence that reminded him why her late husband had valued her counsel above his ministerial colleagues.
"So the Count arranged a theatrical performance," she said finally. "But why?"
Railway competition, perhaps? Or something deeper? Pavel carefully cleaned the knife with his special solution, watching the false tarnish dissolve to reveal the gleaming amalgam beneath. The question becomes whether I tell the truth and accuse a count of fraud, or maintain the lie and become complicit. Vera touched his shoulder gently. Our father would have said that truth is a luxury the powerful neither want nor pay for. Their father, dead 15 years now, had been a pragmatist who'd survived 3 czars and 2 wars by understanding that craft meant more than creating beautiful objects. It meant navigating the dangerous waters between those who commanded and those who served. Pavel had inherited not just his tools, but his wisdom, though sometimes that wisdom sat heavy as lead in his stomach. Morning brought unexpected complications.
Timofey arrived with a split lip and bruised knuckles, his usual enthusiasm replaced by sullen defeat.
Merchant Kulikov's footmen, he explained when pressed. They explained that I wasn't to loiter near their gate anymore. Pavel examined the boy's injuries with practiced efficiency. His own youth had included enough fights to recognize defensive wounds. You didn't strike back? I wanted to, Timofey admitted. But I remembered what you taught me about choosing battles. The boy's restraint showed growth, though Pavel suspected it had more to do with not wanting to completely destroy his chances with Anna Kulikova than with wisdom. They worked in companionable silence until mid-morning, when a carriage bearing the von Rosen arms pulled up outside. Pavel had expected this visit, though not so soon. The Baron entered the workshop alone, dismissing his footmen with Teutonic efficiency.
In daylight, without the theatrical atmosphere of the Count's dinner, he appeared younger than his 35 years, with the kind of nervous energy that built railroads and destroyed traditions with equal enthusiasm. "I need to know what you discovered," the Baron said without preamble. Germans, Pavel had learned, viewed small talk as inefficiency. Pavel showed him the knife, now restored to its false glory. He demonstrated the reaction with citric acid, watched understanding dawn in the Baron's pale eyes. "The wine," von Rosen said suddenly. "The Count personally poured my wine, insisted on a toast. The glass had residue on the rim. I thought it was sugar for sweetening, but—" "Citric acid crystals would look similar," Pavel confirmed. "Transfer from glass to fingers, fingers to knife." The Baron laughed, bitter as winter wind. "Theatrical indeed. The Count knows I have documents that would expose his debts, his mortgaged estates. He needed to discredit me before I could present them to the other investors." He studied Pavel with sharp intelligence. "What will you tell him?" Here lay the razor's edge Pavel had been dreading. "I serve my craft, not politics," he said carefully. "I'll tell the Count the knife has been purified, which is true. What conclusions he draws from that?" Pavel spread his hands in a gesture of calculated helplessness. The Baron placed a considerable sum on the workbench. "For your discretion, though I suspect you'd have given it anyway. You have the look of a man who's learned to survive between millstones." After von Rosen departed, Pavel noticed Vera watching from the doorway to their quarters. "You heard?" "Enough." She held a letter, her fingers worrying its edges. "Speaking of complications, this came while you were occupied with the Baron." The letter bore no seal, just her name in careful Cyrillic script. Pavel recognized the writing. It belonged to the retired teacher she'd been visiting, the one who lived near the Haymarket and gave free lessons to factory children. "He's not what he seems," Vera said quietly. "None of them are in this city of facades and silver-plated truths." Pavel didn't press. His sister deserved her secrets, just as he deserved his. They were all navigating their own dangerous waters, calculating the cost of truth against the price of survival. The Dolgorukov knife gleamed on his workbench, a testament to how even precious metal could be made to lie. 3 days passed in deceptive normalcy before Baron von Rosen returned, this time arriving after dark like a conspirator in a penny novel. Pavel found him waiting in the workshop's shadows, having somehow slipped past the locked door, a skill unexpected in a railway magnate, but perhaps essential for survival in Petersburg's current climate. "Forgive the dramatic entrance," the Baron said, though his tone suggested little concern for forgiveness. "The Count has men watching my residence. They're not particularly subtle. Former soldiers, I'd guess. The kind who learned their trade suppressing Polish uprisings." Pavel lit additional lamps, noting how the Baron positioned himself to keep all exits in view. The German's nervousness had evolved into something sharper, more calculated. Here was a man reassessing his position on a dangerous board. "You could go to the authorities," Pavel suggested, though they both knew the futility of that path. "Which authorities?" von Rosen asked with bitter amusement. "The third section, who view all foreigners as potential revolutionaries? The regular police, who wouldn't dare move against a Dolgorukov? Or perhaps the courts, where cases involving nobility disappear like spring snow." The Baron produced a leather portfolio from his coat, spreading documents across Pavel's workbench with the same precision he might use for railway blueprints. "These show the Count's true financial position. He's mortgaged everything. The estate in Tver, his wife's jewelry, even the famous knife set." He paused, letting that last detail settle. "Yes, the real knives were sold 6 months ago to a collector in London. What you handled was one of 12 replacements." Pavel studied the documents, though their legal language might as well have been Chinese. Still, he recognized desperation in the sheer volume of creditors listed. "Why show me this?" "Because you're the only neutral party in this farce," von Rosen replied. "The Count needs my German investors to avoid bankruptcy. I need his political connections to secure railway rights." "We're locked in a dance where each step could destroy us both." He gathered the papers carefully. "But there's something else. Something the Count doesn't know. I know." The Baron glanced toward the stairs leading to Pavel's living quarters, ensuring they were truly alone. "The young Countess visits a certain doctor near the Fontanka, a discreet man who specializes in delicate, feminine conditions. She's been trying to produce an heir for 2 years without success. The fault, the doctor confided after sufficient monetary persuasion, lies not with her." Pavel felt the uncomfortable weight of unwanted knowledge. The aristocracy's private disasters had a way of creating public casualties, and he had no desire to be counted among them. "Baron, I'm a silversmith, not a confessor or conspirator." "No, but you're something rarer. An honest man in a dishonest situation." Von Rosen moved toward the door, then paused. "The Count will summon you soon to confirm the knife's purification. He'll stage another dinner, a public vindication where the knife remains bright in my hands. He needs this theater to restore confidence among the investors I've supposedly tried to murder."
The prediction proved accurate. The next morning, a Dolgorukov footman arrived with an invitation, though commands from counts merely dressed themselves in courtesy's clothing. Pavel was to attend dinner that very evening, bringing the restored knife and his professional testimony about its cleaning. Timofey watched the preparations with barely concealed agitation. The boy had been distracted all week, his work suffering from whatever romantic catastrophe occupied his mind. "Master," he finally ventured, "if someone you cared for was being forced into something against their will, what would you do?" Pavel recognized the signs. Young love preparing for grand gestures that usually ended in disaster.
"I'd remember that force takes many forms," he answered carefully. "Poverty forces us to work. Duty forces us to obey. Love forces us to foolishness. The question isn't what we're forced to do, but what we choose within those constraints." The boy nodded, though Pavel doubted he'd truly heard the wisdom. Youth rarely did until it became experience, usually painful. Before leaving for the Dolgorukov mansion, Pavel caught Timofey writing furiously. Another letter to the merchant's daughter, no doubt. The boy's penmanship had improved considerably. Silver work demanded precise hands, and that precision translated to other arts. Vera intercepted Pavel at the door, pressing a small vial into his hand. "Ammonia solution," she said quietly, "in case you need to demonstrate cleaning techniques." But her eyes suggested other possibilities. Ammonia could reveal certain deceptions as easily as it cleaned silver. The streets toward Millionaya had taken on winter's first serious threat. Ice formed treacherous patterns on cobblestones, and Pavel picked his way carefully, aware that a silversmith with broken fingers faced ruin. The city seemed to hold its breath, caught between seasons, just as the empire itself hung between old certainties and new dangers. The Dolgorukov mansion blazed with light, every window a golden rectangle against the darkening sky. Carriages lined the street like expensive beetles, disgorging guests who moved through the cold in furs that cost more than Pavel earned in a decade. He entered through the service door this time, his status clear despite the Count's summons. In the kitchen, amid controlled chaos of preparation, Pavel recognized several faces from the previous dinner's serving staff. They avoided his eyes with practiced discretion. Everyone here knew something, it seemed, but knowing and acknowledging were separated by gulfs as wide as the Neva. The Count received him in the same study, though this time Father Seraphim waited as well. The priest looked older than his 61 years, his face bearing the weight of secrets that prayer couldn't lift. "Pavel Ivanovich," the priest said warmly, "I hoped we might speak before this evening's demonstration." The Count excused himself to see to his guests, leaving Pavel alone with the man who'd baptized him 40 years ago. Father Seraphim moved to the window, watching the arriving carriages with an expression that mixed resignation with something deeper. "Your grandfather made the original knives," he said without preamble. "Did you know that?" Pavel's shock must have shown because the priest continued quickly. "Oh, yes, Pyotr Pavlovich was the finest silversmith of his generation. The commission from Catherine herself, though the legend about revealing murderers—" The priest shrugged eloquently. "Stories grow in the telling, especially stories that serve powerful interests." The dinner proceeded with the mechanical precision of a clock whose gears had been oiled with anxiety. Pavel stood in his designated position, holding the restored knife like a relic, while Count Dolgorukov orchestrated the evening's redemption.
Baron von Rosen played his part with Teutonic stoicism, allowing the Count to place the now gleaming knife in his hands before the assembled guests. "Behold," the Count announced with theatrical satisfaction, "the silver's judgment reversed. Our good Baron has been cleansed of whatever shadow momentarily clouded his heart." The knife remained brilliant in von Rosen's grip, no trace of tarnish appearing despite the Count's obvious anticipation of divine vindication. The guests murmured their approval, though Pavel detected skepticism in some faces. Modern times had begun teaching even aristocrats to doubt convenient miracles.
The Countess Maria Alexandrovna watched from her place at the table's far end, her beauty unmarred but somehow dimmed, like silver that had been polished too often. After sufficient display, Pavel was dismissed to the kitchen with instructions to secure the knife until the meal's end. He found himself in the servants' pantry, a narrow room lined with silver services that represented more wealth than most Russians would see in their lifetimes. Each piece bore the Dolgorukov arms, a two-headed eagle clutching oak branches, worked with varying degrees of skill across what must have been centuries of accumulation. He'd barely settled when the door opened silently. The Countess slipped inside with the practiced stealth of someone who'd learned to move through her own house like a ghost. At 23, Maria Alexandrovna possessed that particular beauty that seemed to apologize for its own existence, as if aware of the disruption it caused in ordered lives.
"You know they're false,"
she said without preamble.
"The knives. You must have realized immediately."
Pavel considered denying it, but something in her desperate eyes made dishonesty seem cruel.
The workmanship suggested reproduction, yes. She laughed, but the sound contained no joy.
"Reproduction. How apt. That's all I am, too. A reproduction of a wife, a countess, a potential mother."
She moved closer, and Pavel smelled French perfume underlaid with something sharper, laudanum, perhaps, or another fashionable poison the nobility used to smooth life's edges.
"I commissioned the copies myself,"
she continued, her words tumbling like water through a broken dam.
6 months ago, when Arkady sold the originals to cover his gambling debts. He doesn't know I know, just as he doesn't know I've been selling my jewelry piece by piece, replacing diamonds with paste, pearls with painted glass.
Pavel felt the familiar discomfort of being drawn into aristocratic drama.
Yet something about her desperation echoed Vera's quiet sadness, Timofey's frustrated love, the universal pain of those trapped by circumstances beyond their control.
"Why tell me this, Your Excellency?"
"Because you're the only person in Petersburg who knows the truth, but wants nothing from it."
She pulled a small leather purse from her dress, pressing it into Pavel's hands.
"This isn't a bribe. It's payment for a commission. I need you to create something for me, a piece of silver that tells the truth."
Before Pavel could respond, she described her request. A hand mirror backed with silver, inscribed with a particular verse from Ecclesiastes about vanity. But hidden within the decorative work, she wanted something else. The date of her marriage and, she hoped, the date of her freedom.
"He's dying," she said simply. "The doctor doesn't know I overhead, but Arkady has perhaps 6 months. The same blood disease that took his father."
The revelation hung between them like incense.
Pavel understood now why the Count so desperately needed the railway investment. Not for grand ventures, but for the illusion of continuity, something to leave behind besides debt and dissolution.
And Baron von Rosen knows nothing of the illness. Arkady would rather destroy him than show weakness. She moved toward the door,
then paused. "The chemical compound on the knife. That was my idea. A parlor trick I learned in Paris, where they use it for seances and spirit manifestations. Arkady needed a dramatic revelation to discredit the Baron before financial investigations began." She left as silently as she'd entered, leaving Pavel holding her gold coins and the weight of yet another secret. He thought of his grandfather, apparently the creator of the original knives, and wondered if Pyotr Pavlovich had also found himself caught between truth and power, craft and conspiracy. Returning to the kitchen, Pavel encountered Father Seraphim warming himself by the massive stove.
The priest looked older in the servants' quarters, more human without the cathedral's grandeur to prop him up.
"She told you," the priest said. It wasn't a question. "Everyone tells me things," Pavel replied wearily. "As if being a craftsman makes me a repository for secrets they can't bear to hold alone." Father Seraphim smiled sadly. "Your grandfather said something similar. He called himself a merchant of memories. People gave him their stories along with their silver, asking him to transform both into something bearable." Through the kitchen window they could see snow beginning to fall, the first serious snow of the season. It would cover Petersburg's sins and splendors alike, creating that brief democracy of white where palace and workshop looked equally pristine. "What would you have me do, Father?" Pavel asked.
"What you've always done. Practice your craft with integrity, even when surrounded by those who've forgotten what that word means." The priest pulled his worn coat tighter. "The Countess is right about one thing. The Count is dying, though he doesn't know she knows. She's also right that the Baron threatens everything. But she's wrong about her freedom. Arkady's debts will chain her long after his death unless she finds a protector." Pavel thought of the Baron with his German efficiency and railway dreams, the Countess with her Parisian sophistication and hidden desperation, the Count with his fatal blood and fatal pride. They were all dancing on ice that grew thinner with each turn, and somehow he'd been drafted as an unwilling musician for their fatal waltz. Back in his workshop near midnight, Pavel found Timofey still awake, surrounded by crumpled papers and empty ink bottles. "Master," the boy said, his young face drawn with determination, "I've made a decision about Anna." "I'm going to apprentice with the jeweler Fabergé. He's accepted me based on the samples you let me create. With his name behind me, even Merchant Kulikov couldn't refuse me." Pavel felt simultaneous pride and loss. Fabergé would indeed elevate the boy beyond his current station, but it meant losing the best apprentice he'd trained. Still, wasn't this what craft meant? Passing skills forward even when it cost you? Father Seraphim's summons arrived on a morning when ice fog transformed Petersburg into a city of suggestions rather than certainties. The note requested Pavel's presence at St. Isaac's Cathedral, not for confession, but for what the priest termed a matter of historical clarity. Pavel left Timofey practicing his increasingly elaborate designs. The boy's impending departure to Fabergé had inspired a frenzy of creative output, as if he needed to prove his readiness through sheer volume. The cathedral loomed through the fog like a golden mountain, its dome disappearing into white obscurity. Pavel entered through a side door known to few outside the clergy, following corridors that smelled of beeswax and centuries of prayer. He found Father Seraphim in the vestry, examining documents that looked older than both of them combined. "Your grandfather's records," the priest explained, gesturing to papers covered in faded Cyrillic. "I've been guardian of these since before you were born." The time has come for truth, I think. Or at least as much truth as old men can bear. The documents told a story Pavel had never suspected. Pyotr Pavlovich, master silversmith, had indeed created the famous knives for Catherine the Great, but not as a reward for loyalty revealed. Rather, they were part of an elaborate deception designed to root out conspirators through fear rather than magic. The Empress, ever theatrical, had commissioned the legend along with the silver. She understood that belief shapes behavior more than reality, Father Seraphim explained. If conspirators believed the knives would reveal them, they'd reveal themselves through nervousness, through avoidance, through the very fear of discovery. Pavel studied his grandfather's sketches. The knives were masterworks of psychology as much as silvercraft. Each hunting scene contained subtle details that would catch guilty eyes. A stag looking backward at pursuing hounds, a falcon with a mouse in its talons, a bear trap hidden among forest leaves. He designed them to disturb, Pavel murmured. More than that. He created 12 sets over his lifetime, each slightly different, each serving the same purpose for different noble families. The priest produced a ledger listing names Pavel recognized from history books and court gossip alike. The Dolgorukovs were simply the latest to believe their set unique. This revelation cast new light on recent events. The Count's theatrical exposure of Baron von Rosen followed a pattern established generations ago. Powerful families using fear and superstition to maintain control. Why tell me this now, Father? The priest moved to the window overlooking the frozen Neva. At 61, his movements carried the careful deliberation of age, but his mind remained sharp as winter air. Because the pattern is breaking. Science advances, education spreads, even among servants. The old tricks lose their power. The Count's display fooled some, but others whispered about chemistry and trickery. Father Seraphim produced another document, this one bearing Pavel's own father's signature. Your father knew the truth. He chose to preserve it, believing that comfortable lies served society better than uncomfortable truths. But you... The priest studied Pavel with eyes that had witnessed too many confessions. You have a decision to make. Before Pavel could respond, a commotion arose from the cathedral's main sanctuary. They hurried to investigate, finding a small crowd gathered around a figure collapsed near the altar. Pavel recognized the expensive coat before he saw the face. Count Dolgorukov lay twisted on the marble floor, his face the color of old parchment. His heart, someone whispered. The strain of recent events. But Pavel, kneeling beside the Count, detected the sweet almond scent that his father had taught him to recognize. Prussic acid, cyanide. The Count's lips bore faint traces of blue, and his dying eyes held not surprise but resignation, perhaps even relief. In his coat pocket, Pavel found a small vial, empty but for residue that would confirm what his nose already knew. Father Seraphim administered last rites while Pavel stepped back, processing implications. Suicide among nobility wasn't unknown, but it created complications that rippled through society like stones in still water. The Countess would be free, but disgraced. The Baron would face questions about whether he'd driven a man to desperate measures. The entire railway venture would collapse under scandal's weight. As the church filled with police and officials, Pavel noticed a familiar figure among the gathering crowd. Vera stood near the entrance, but she wasn't alone. Beside her waited a man Pavel recognized from descriptions but had never met. Konstantin Sergeyevich,
the retired teacher from near the Haymarket. Except Pavel now understood he was no teacher, but one of those political exiles who survived on the margins of legal existence, teaching revolutionary ideas along with grammar to factory children. Vera met Pavel's eyes across the sanctuary, with a look that mixed defiance with plea.
Her secret stood revealed in the most public possible forum, and Pavel realized that his sister had been navigating her own dangerous waters, while he'd been absorbed in aristocratic dramas. The third section's agents were already taking note of who attended this unexpected gathering, their practiced eyes cataloging faces for future reference. Inspector Lebedev of the police arrived with his characteristic efficiency, a man of 45 who'd risen through ranks by solving cases others preferred to ignore. He questioned witnesses with methodical persistence, his manner suggesting he already knew more than he revealed. When he reached Pavel, his questions were particularly pointed. "You've been much in the Count's company lately," Lebedev observed. "First the incident with the knives, now this. An interesting coincidence." Pavel chose his words carefully. "I'm a silversmith, Inspector. The Count required my services. Nothing more complicated than that." Lebedev smiled thinly. In my experience, Pavel Ivanovich, everything involving the aristocracy is complicated. But you're right. You're just a craftsman caught in their web. He paused meaningfully. Best to remain that way, don't you think?
The warning was clear. Lebedev knew more than he was pursuing, choosing stability over truth. It was the Petersburg way, everyone knowing something, no one knowing everything, all agreeing to maintain the elaborate fiction that kept the city functioning. As Pavel prepared to leave, Father Seraphim caught his arm. "Your grandfather would be proud," the priest said quietly. "He too understood when to speak and when to remain silent. The real craft isn't in working silver, but in navigating between those who wear it and those who polish it." Inspector Lebedev appeared at Pavel's workshop 3 days after the Count's funeral, arriving with the dawn like bad news that couldn't wait.
He entered without ceremony, his practiced eyes cataloging every tool, every piece in progress, every possible hiding place for secrets. At 45, Lebedev possessed that particular weariness of men who'd seen too much of human nature's darker specimens. "Tea?" Pavel offered, recognizing this visit would require patience. Vera descended with the samovar, her movements careful as she navigated around the inspector's deliberate positioning. She'd been quiet since the cathedral incident, her secret friendship with the political exile now exposed to official scrutiny. Lebedev accepted the tea with unexpected grace. "Your sister makes excellent tea," he observed. "My wife insists the secret is in the water temperature, but I suspect it's more about the hands that pour it." The compliment carried edges, reminders that he knew about Vera, about her dangerous associations, about the sword hanging over their household. "The Count's death," Lebedev began after sufficient preliminaries, "presents certain difficulties. Suicide suggests scandal. Scandal suggests investigation. Investigation disturbs many who prefer their waters untroubled." He produced the empty vial from his coat. "Prussic acid, quick, relatively painless, favored by those who plan their exits carefully." Pavel remained silent. In his experience, investigators talked most when they wanted others to talk least. "But here's what puzzles me," Lebedev continued, turning the vial in his fingers. "The Count had no access to such substances.
His household staff swears to it, his wife confirms it, even his physician expresses surprise. So where does a debt-ridden aristocrat obtain poison typically reserved for pest control in industrial settings? Through the workshop window, Pavel could see Timofey arriving for the day's work, though the boy would soon leave for Fabergé's establishment.
The apprentice paused outside, clearly recognizing the police carriage and calculating whether to enter or flee. Youth always imagined itself guilty of something, Pavel reflected, while age knew guilt was universal and therefore unremarkable. Baron von Rosen has interests in several chemical factories, Lebedev noted, watching Pavel's reaction. The Countess, I'm told, studied natural philosophy in Paris, where such knowledge is fashionably dangerous for young women. Even your friend Father Seraphim maintains a surprisingly well-stocked medical cabinet for blessing the sick. The inspector's implications spread like spilled mercury, touching everything while adhering to nothing. Pavel understood the game. Lebedev was offering him a choice of truths, each with different consequences. "I'm a silversmith," Pavel said finally. "I work with metals, not mysteries." "Ah, but silver tells stories, doesn't it?" Lebedev produced one of the notorious knives, though whether original or copy, Pavel couldn't immediately determine. "This blade, for instance, tells of 3 generations of deception. Your grandfather's creation, your father's maintenance of the myth, your own recent involvement in its perpetuation." The inspector's knowledge ran deeper than Pavel had suspected. Here was a man who collected truths the way others collected coins, hoarding them against future need. "What do you want, Inspector?" "Want? I want Petersburg to continue functioning despite its inhabitants' best efforts to destroy themselves. I want the railway built because progress, however corrupted, beats stagnation. I want the Countess to find happiness with whoever can afford her husband's debts. I want your sister to stop associating with political dreamers who will end up in Siberia, or worse." Lebedev stood, adjusting his coat with military precision. "Most of all, I want craftsmen to remain craftsmen, not players in games beyond their station." After the inspector departed, Timofey entered hesitantly. "Master, was that about—" "Nothing concerning you," Pavel assured him, though everything concerned everyone in Petersburg's web of connection and consequence. "Show me your latest design." The boy produced a sketch for a locket that demonstrated real artistry, delicate without fragility, ornate without excess. It would serve him well at Fabergé's, where innovation balanced with tradition. "For Anna," Timofey admitted unnecessarily. Love announced itself in every careful line. "She's accepted your suit?" Pavel asked, though he knew the answer from the boy's suppressed joy. "Her father has agreed to consider it once I'm established with Fabergé." He says a man who can rise from foundling to court jeweler might rise further still. Timofey's pride battled with anxiety about leaving Pavel's workshop, the only real home he'd known. Vera joined them, her face drawn but determined. "Konstantin Sergeyevich is leaving Petersburg," she announced, "tonight. The inspector's visit was warning enough." She held a letter, its edges worn from repeated reading. "He's asked me to come with him." The workshop fell silent except for the street sounds filtering through closed windows. Pavel saw his world fracturing. Timofey to Fabergé, Vera to exile, himself increasingly alone with silver and secrets. Yet perhaps this was natural progression, the way apprentices became masters and sisters found their own paths. "He's a good man," Vera continued, defiance creeping into her voice.
He teaches children to read, not revolution.
His crime is believing education shouldn't be reserved for those who can afford it. Pavel thought of Inspector Lebedev's warning, the Count's suicide, the Countess's uncertain future, Baron von Rosen's ambitions. Everyone was choosing sides in conflicts that would shape Russia's future, while he remained at his bench, working metal into meaning. "What will you do?"
I don't know, Vera admitted. The heart wants what it wants, but the mind knows what things cost. She touched the locket at her throat, a piece Pavel had made for her husband years ago. You taught me that silver tarnishes when exposed to air. Perhaps people do too, when exposed to too much truth.
That evening, as Pavel worked alone in the workshop, he heard commotion from the street. Through the window, he glimpsed a police wagon outside the building where Konstantin Sergeyevich lodged. The third section moved with practiced efficiency, sealing doors, questioning neighbors, creating that particular silence that followed political arrests. Vera stood beside him, watching her possibility disappear into official custody. She didn't cry. Tears were for private grief, not public catastrophe. "He knew they were coming," she said quietly. "His last letter told me to stay away, to claim ignorance if questioned." The wagon disappeared into the fog that rose nightly from the Neva, carrying away another dreamer who'd mistaken education for revolution. Pavel put his arm around his sister, feeling her tremble with suppressed emotion. The smell of smoke invaded Pavel's dreams first, weaving through images of silver melting into impossible shapes. He woke to find reality more terrifying than nightmare. Orange light flickered through his bedroom floorboards, and the acrid scent of burning wood filled his nostrils. The workshop below was ablaze. "Vera!" Pavel shouted, grabbing his sister's door. She emerged, already dressed, clutching the small box of valuables they kept for emergencies. Together they descended the stairs, only to find the workshop's main room engulfed. Flames danced among Pavel's tools, his careful organization transformed into chaos. The heat drove them back, but not before Pavel saw something that made his blood cold. The fire had multiple origins, separate blazes that couldn't have started naturally. They escaped through the rear entrance, joining the gathering crowd as neighbors formed bucket lines. The German pharmacist next door directed efforts with military efficiency, while the bookbinder wept for his own threatened stock. Pavel noticed faces in the crowd that didn't belong, too well-dressed for this working district, too interested in his reaction rather than the fire itself. Timofey appeared through the smoke like a soot-covered angel, leading the firefighting brigade he'd somehow summoned. "I was walking Anna home," he gasped, between directions to the firefighters. "Saw the glow from 2 streets away." The boy threw himself into saving what could be saved, directing water toward the walls shared with neighboring buildings. As dawn broke over the controlled devastation, Pavel surveyed his losses. The forge survived, being stone and metal, but his wooden workbenches were charred ruins. His tools, some inherited from his father, lay twisted and blackened. Most devastating was the loss of works in progress, including the Countess's mirror and several commissions that represented months of income. Inspector Lebedev arrived as the last flames died, his presence drawing nervous glances from the assembled crowd. He examined the scene with professional detachment, noting the multiple ignition points Pavel had observed. "Interesting," he murmured, though nothing about his expression suggested surprise. "3 separate origins," Pavel said quietly, joining the inspector's investigation. "Here by the window,
there near the silver cabinet, and another by the rear entrance. Someone wanted to ensure the fire took hold.
Lebedev nodded, producing a partially melted silver button from near the window. Quality work, military style. The kind worn by former officers who now find employment in private service. He didn't need to elaborate. Such men worked for whoever paid, creating problems or solving them with equal efficiency. Baron von Rosen arrived in his personal carriage, an unexpected appearance that set tongues wagging. He surveyed the damage with genuine distress.
Pavel Ivanovich, this is unconscionable. Whatever our past disagreements, no craftsman should suffer such loss.
He pulled out a substantial purse, but Pavel hesitated to accept it.
I don't take charity, Baron. Not charity, investment. I need a silversmith I can trust for my railway ventures.
Consider this in advance on future commissions. The German's pale eyes suggested he knew more about the fire's origins than he expressed. Besides, I suspect we share certain enemies now.
The Countess, now widow, Dolgorukova, arrived next, dressed in mourning that couldn't disguise her relief at freedom. She gasped at the destruction, then turned to Pavel with unexpected determination.
"You'll rebuild," she declared. "I'll insure it. My husband's estate, despite its debts, still carries influence. Those responsible will answer for this."
Pavel wondered at this parade of noble support. Each visitor seemed to carry pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite assemble. The fire had been deliberate, but whose hand had struck the match? Someone who wanted him silenced, certainly, but about which secret? As the crowd dispersed, the bookbinder approached Pavel with nervous excitement.
"I saw something last night," he whispered, "before the fire started."
A man at your rear entrance, well-dressed, carrying something. He dropped this. The bookbinder produced a small appointment book, its pages singed but readable. Pavel recognized the handwriting. It belonged to Count Dolgorukov's former secretary, a man who'd disappeared the day after the Count's death. The pages contained appointments, notes, and, most interestingly, a list of names, including Pavel's, marked with symbols he couldn't interpret. But one entry stood clear: remove impediments to testament execution.
"The Count changed his will,"
the Countess said when Pavel showed her the book that afternoon. She'd taken rooms at a respectable hotel, her mourning offset by an energy suggesting rebirth.
3 days before his death, he left substantial debts, but also hidden assets, silver and gold cached away over generations.
The will's executor was to be someone he trusted, someone outside the family who couldn't be corrupted. Pavel's workshop had been temporary headquarters for various neighborhood efforts all day, women bringing food, men offering tools and labor, even rival craftsmen setting aside competition to help one of their own. This was Petersburg's other face, the one hidden beneath aristocratic dramas and political machinations. Here, survival meant cooperation. Vera orchestrated the relief efforts with quiet efficiency, her grief over Konstantin Sergeyevich transformed into purposeful action.
"We've been offered the vacant shop on Voznesensky Prospect," she told Pavel. "The owner says you repaired his father's samovar 20 years ago, never charged him properly. He remembers."
Father Seraphim arrived as evening fell, bringing unexpected news.
"The Count's hidden cash," he said carefully, "was your grandfather's work."
Pyotr Pavlovich created a special strongbox, supposedly unopenable except by someone who understood both silvercraft and the family's history. The Count, in his growing paranoia,
decided only someone unconnected to current conflicts could be trusted with it. The pieces finally assembled in Pavel's mind. The Count had named him executor, trusting the silversmith's reputation for discretion. Someone, likely the disappeared secretary working for unknown interests, had tried to eliminate Pavel before the will could be read publicly. The fire was meant to kill, or at least discourage him from accepting the responsibility. "Where is this strong box?" Pavel asked, though he suspected he already knew. "In the cathedral crypt," Father Seraphim replied, "where your grandfather placed it 60 years ago, waiting for a moment like this." He studied Pavel with those eyes that had seen too many confessions. "The question is, whether you want this burden."
Wealth attracts envy. Responsibility attracts danger. The cathedral crypt smelled of centuries and secrets, that particular mixture of stone, dust, and sanctified decay that marked Petersburg's older churches. Pavel descended the worn steps with Father Seraphim's lantern casting dancing shadows across carved memorials to forgotten nobles. His hands, still bearing burns from the workshop fire, ached with each movement, but purpose drove him forward. The strong box waited behind the Dolgorukov family tomb, concealed within what appeared to be decorative stonework. Only someone who knew silver's properties would recognize the clever mechanism, temperature-sensitive latches that required specific warming patterns to release. Pavel's grandfather had created not just a lock, but a test, ensuring only a true craftsman could access the contents. Working by lamplight, Pavel applied heated tools and the sequence his trained eye recognized. The silver responded like a living thing, expanding and contracting until, with a sound like a sigh, the strong box opened. Inside lay not the gold the Count had hoarded, but something far more dangerous. Documents that revealed the true scope of various aristocratic conspiracies. Financial records that implicated half of Petersburg's elite in fraud. And at the bottom, the genuine knife set his grandfather had created for Catherine. The Count was no fool, Father Seraphim observed, reading over Pavel's shoulder. He knew his enemies would destroy each other to possess these secrets. By naming you executor, he placed a bomb in the hands of the only person with no political ambitions to exploit it. Above them, footsteps echoed through the cathedral. Multiple sets, moving with purpose rather than piety. Pavel quickly selected several documents, leaving others, his mind calculating rapidly. The complete truth would destroy too many lives, but selective revelation might restore balance to the chaos following the Count's death. They emerged to find Inspector Lebedev waiting with several officers, but also Baron von Rosen and the Countess. The disappeared secretary stood in custody, his fine clothes replaced by prison gray. "An interesting assembly," Lebedev noted dryly. "Almost as if everyone received the same anonymous message about tonight's activities." Pavel placed the strongbox on the altar with deliberate ceremony. "The Count's legacy," he announced, "belongs to his widow." He handed the Countess a sealed envelope from within. His true will, naming her sole inheritor of remaining assets after debt settlement. The document was genuine. Pavel had seen the Count's shaking signature, dated the day of his death. "But the executor," the secretary protested before Lebedev's glare silenced him. "The Count named me executor of specific items," Pavel continued, producing several documents. "These financial records showing the secretary's embezzlement over 3 years, which drove the Count to desperate measures.
These proving Baron von Rosen's complete innocence in any conspiracy, merely an honest competitor in business. And these, he held up papers that made several watching faces pale. These will remain sealed unless certain parties continue their harassment of innocent craftsmen and their families. The threat hung like incense in the sacred space. Pavel had learned the Petersburg game at last, not the crude blackmail of criminals, but the delicate balance of mutual deterrence that kept the city's powerful in check. Baron von Rosen stepped forward, his expression mixing admiration with relief. "The Railway Consortium will honor all contracts with local craftsmen," he announced, "including substantial compensation for recent losses due to
unfortunate accidents." The Countess, reading her husband's true will, began crying. Not tears of grief, but of recognition. The Count's final words to her revealed his knowledge of his own failings, his regret at the age difference that had trapped them both, and his hope that she might find happiness with someone whose ambitions match her intelligence rather than her beauty. Pavel suspected the Count had known about her feelings for the Baron, feelings that propriety had kept buried until now. "The real knives," Inspector Lebedev said, examining the originals with professional interest. "These should go to a museum, don't you think? Let scholars debate their supposed powers while the rest of us get on with living." But Pavel had one more revelation. He produced the knife that had blackened in Baron von Rosen's hand, now cleaned of its chemical coating. "This one should remain with the family," he said, offering it to the Countess. "Your grandfather was a chemist, wasn't he?" "You learned the compound from him, applied it yourself, knowing the Count would use it against the Baron. You wanted to discredit your husband's suspicion, to protect the man you—" He let the sentence trail off. Maria Alexandrovna's face revealed everything. Surprise at his deduction, relief at its private nature, gratitude for his discretion. She accepted the knife with hands that trembled slightly. "Some truths," she said quietly, "are better left in Silver's keeping." The assembly dispersed into the Petersburg night, each carrying their portion of secrets and revelations. The secretary would face trial for embezzlement, but not murder. The Count's suicide would be attributed to financial despair rather than poison, a gentler fiction for all concerned. Baron von Rosen and the Countess would observe proper mourning before their inevitable union, their romance transformed from scandal to redemption. Inspector Lebedev lingered, studying Pavel with new respect. "You could have had everything. Executives' fees, blackmail potential, power over half the nobility." "I'm a silversmith," Pavel replied simply. "I shape metal, not lives. The power you describe would reshape me into something I don't wish to become." Back at the temporary workshop on Voznesensky Prospect, Pavel found unexpected warmth. The Craftsmen's Guild had worked through the night, installing equipment salvaged from his burned shop and supplementing it with donated tools. Timofey was there, directing placement with newfound authority. Fabergé himself had sent several pieces of equipment, noting that investing in future talent meant supporting its foundations. Vera had transformed the upper rooms into living quarters, somehow making the strange space feel like home. "Konstantin Sergeyevich sends his regards," she said quietly, showing Pavel a letter that had arrived through mysterious channels. "He's in Siberia, but teaching at the prison school." He says the students are more motivated than any he's had before. The revelation that her friend lived, even in exile, had restored something in Vera. She moved with new purpose, organizing not just their household, but beginning to teach neighborhood children their letters, continuing Konstantin's work in her own careful way.
As Pavel examined his new workshop, he found his father's hammer among the salvaged tools, its handle charred, but the head still true. He hefted it, feeling the weight of generations in his grip. Tomorrow he would begin the Countess's mirror, working silver into truth as his grandfather had done, as his father had done, as Timofey would do in grander settings. April of 1864 arrived with unusual warmth, transforming Petersburg's frozen canals into flowing waterways that reflected the sky like channels of molten silver.
Pavel stood at his new workshop's window, watching ice break apart and drift toward the sea, each piece carrying winter's memory toward oblivion.
6 months had passed since the fire, since the Count's death, since the world had rearranged itself around different truths. The workshop on Voznesensky Prospect had evolved from temporary shelter into something finer than what he'd lost. The tools gleamed in morning light, each in its designated place, the forge burning steady and true. On his primary workbench lay the completed mirror for the now remarried Maria von Rosen, its silver back inscribed with Ecclesiastes, but also, hidden in the decorative border, tiny seams of renewal, phoenixes, spring flowers, suns emerging from clouds. Timofey visited weekly, though he now wore the fine clothes befitting Fabergé's senior apprentice. Today he brought his wife, Anna, her merchant father having consented to their marriage once the young man's prospects became undeniable.
She carried herself with the careful dignity of those who've risen in station, but her genuine affection for Timofey softened any pretension.
"Master Pavel," Timofey said, producing a small box, "I've brought something for you to see." Inside lay a silver egg no larger than a walnut, its surface covered in scales so fine they seemed like breathing skin. At the touch of a hidden spring, it opened to reveal a tiny workshop, complete with a figure bent over an even tinier anvil. "For the Easter exhibition," Timofey explained. Fabergé himself suggested the subject, the craftsman's dream. Pavel examined his former apprentice's work with professional admiration tinged with personal pride. The boy had surpassed his teacher, as was proper. Each generation should build higher than the last, else what was the point of passing knowledge forward? Vera entered carrying tea and fresh bread from the bakery that had opened across the street.
At 39, she'd grown into her widowhood with unexpected grace, teaching letters and numbers to neighborhood children in the afternoons, maintaining correspondence with distant friends who wrote from exile about snow and hope. She'd refused 2 marriage proposals from respectable merchants, claiming she'd had her love and wouldn't accept substitutes.
"Baron von Rosen is here," she announced, though her tone suggested no surprise. The Baron had become a regular visitor, commissioning pieces for his railway ventures, but also, Pavel suspected, simply enjoying conversation with someone who knew his full story, yet demanded nothing from it. The Baron entered accompanied by his wife, the former Countess Dolgorukova. Their recent marriage had scandalized some, satisfied others, but mostly confirmed what Petersburg had always suspected. She looked younger than her 24 years, as if freedom had reversed time's flow.
The mourning clothes were gone, replaced by colors that complemented her renewed vitality.
"The mirror is magnificent," Maria said, running her fingers along its edges. "It tells truth, as requested, though perhaps kinder truth than I deserve." "Truth is neither kind nor cruel," Pavel replied, wrapping the mirror carefully. "It simply is. We bring our own judgments to its surface." Baron von Rosen produced a leather portfolio, spreading blueprints across Pavel's workbench. "The Moscow line is complete. The Kiev route begins construction next month. We'll need ceremonial pieces for the opening, something that captures both tradition and progress. He looked at Pavel meaningfully. I want you to lead the team of craftsmen. Your name carries weight now, after everything. After everything. Such a small phrase for such large changes. The Count's death had been officially recorded as heart failure brought on by financial stress.
The fire at Pavel's workshop was attributed to a lamp left burning, though insurance had paid remarkably quickly. The disappeared secretary had been tried for embezzlement, receiving 10 years in prison, a harsh sentence that discouraged others from asking uncomfortable questions. Inspector Lebedev arrived as the von Rosens departed, passing them with cordial nods that suggested all accounts were settled. He'd gained weight recently, success agreeing with him. Several prominent cases solved, including one involving forged government bonds, had elevated his standing. He brought news that Father Seraphim had requested Pavel's presence for evening service, not for confession, but for an announcement. The good father is finally retiring, Lebedev revealed. 62 years old and tired of keeping everyone's secrets. He's recommending a younger priest, one less burdened by history's weight. That evening, Pavel attended service at St. Isaac's, finding the cathedral packed with familiar faces. Father Seraphim spoke of time and transition, of silver that tarnishes and is polished bright again, of secrets that poison when held too tight, but heal when properly released. His sermon was his farewell, though he promised to remain in Petersburg, tending a small garden and writing his memoirs. Carefully edited, he added with a smile that drew knowing laughter. After the service, Pavel walked home through streets busy with Easter preparations. Vendors sold painted eggs and sweet bread. Children ran despite their parents' scolding. And everywhere the city shed winter's caution for spring's possibility. He passed the site of his old workshop, now rebuilt as a pharmacy that sold modern medicines alongside traditional remedies. The German pharmacist had installed a small plaque. Site of Pavel Ivanovich's silver workshop, 1843 to 1863. Excellence perseveres. In his new workshop, Pavel found an unexpected gift. The original Dolgorukov knives, all 12, arranged in their midnight blue case. A note in Maria von Rosen's hand explained, "These belong with someone who understands that legends are simply truths waiting to be rewritten. Perhaps your future apprentice will need a story to navigate by." Pavel lifted one knife, watching lamplight play across its surface. His grandfather had created these as instruments of deception that revealed truth, just as the copies had been lies that exposed honesty. Silver, he reflected, was like Petersburg itself, reflecting what people brought to it while maintaining its own essential nature. He thought of Timofey crafting wonders for the wealthy, of Vera teaching letters to the poor, of Inspector Lebedev maintaining order through selective blindness, of Father Seraphim retiring with his burden of confessions, of the von Rosens building their future on the ruins of the past. Each had found their way through the labyrinth of that winter's mysteries, emerging changed but not broken. At his bench, Pavel began sketching a new design, a tea service commissioned by a merchant who'd made his fortune selling coal to fuel the new factories. The man wanted something grand, assertive, announcing his arrival in society. Pavel would give him that, but also something more. Hidden in the decorative work would be small reminders of humility, tiny figures of workers whose labor created wealth, minute flowers that bloomed in darkness.
This was his craft's true purpose, Pavel understood now. Not just shaping silver, but encoding meaning, creating objects that carried stories forward through time. Someone, someday, would hold these pieces and wonder about their maker, their moment, their meaning. He would leave them clues, as his grandfather had done, as all craftsmen did who understood that their work outlasted their lives.
The spring night settled over Petersburg like a benediction, carrying the scent of open water and new possibilities. In workshops and palaces, in churches and counting houses, the city's inhabitants pursued their separate dreams, while the Neva flowed eternal, carrying winter's debris toward the sea. And in one workshop, on Voznesensky Prospect, a silversmith worked late into the night, transforming metal into memory, knowing that morning would bring new commissions, new complications, new opportunities to practice the ancient art of making truth beautiful enough to bear.